Hello and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the International Center for Sustainable Carbon. My name is Benedicta and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, sustainable-carbon.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration on the website. Please type in any questions you have in the questions box as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. The subject for today's webinar is Energy Security in Europe following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, presented by Dr. Stephen Mills. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. You'll all be very aware that various things have been going on in Europe recently. And today, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at some of the aspects of energy security in Europe in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the, in fact, huge impacts that this has had on European and global energy markets. So let's just briefly set the scene on the global situation regarding coal. Now, in 2021, the amount of coal used around the world increased by about 5.8%. This reached a total of nearly 8 billion tonnes, an amount that was close to the previous highest global coal consumption recorded in 2013. This increase in coal use resulted from two main causes. Firstly, much of the global economy recovered from the COVID pandemic, with energy use and industrial production returning to pre-pandemic levels. And secondly, it was a consequence of the steep rise in the price of natural gas that many parts of the world experienced. In some countries, this made gas-fired power generation more expensive than coal-fired, so some utilities, where they still have the capabilities, switched back part of their generation to their coal units. Global coal demand has continued to rise, and over the course of the last year, it increased by about 0.7% above the total for 2021, reaching 8 billion tonnes by the end of the year. So what's been happening with the European energy sector in coal in particular? Before we get too far into this, let me just say we were very, very lucky with the winter in Europe last year. We had a relatively wild winter, and this helped cushion the impacts of the war in Ukraine and the sizable effects this had on the European energy markets in general. Despite this, I think it's fair to say that the EU spent most of last year in crisis mode over energy. So, what's been happening with coal? Well, many EU member states have stopped or greatly reduced the production of hard coal in recent years, although it's still important in several countries. The EU's two biggest hard coal producers are Poland and Czechia, who between them produce around 57 million tonnes a year. And of course, smaller amounts are also produced in various other parts of Europe. Now, in the wake of the turmoil in the energy markets, Poland and Czechia have boosted coal production, both to replace imported Russian coal, but also to rely more on their own energy resources. This has helped strengthen their energy security, and that's something you'll hear a lot about in Europe at the moment. Both governments had previously announced plans to wind down some major coal mining operations, but events in Ukraine obviously prompted them to quickly reverse these. Possible mine closure dates were pushed back by at least several years, and coal output has actually increased rather than fallen. Now, besides these two countries, in parts of Eastern Europe in particular, coal remains vitally important, especially for power generation, and significant amounts continue to be produced and supplied to the power sectors in countries such as Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and of course Ukraine. Now, partly as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, a growing number of European countries have returned, at least partially, to coal for producing electricity and heat. However, in most countries that still rely on coal for at least some of their electricity, coal demand in recent years has decreased more slowly than production, so reliance on imported supplies has gone up. In fact, some countries now meet more than 90% of their hard coal demand in this way. Russia had been the biggest coal supplier to the EU for some years, providing almost half of the bloc's coal imports. In 2018, for example, EU coal imports were around 61 million tonnes. And although they fell during the next few years as many European coal power plants were closed, they were still 52 million tonnes in 2021. Now, during that year, so before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, EU coal consumption had increased, partly in response to the rapidly rising natural gas prices. The result was, as I've already alluded to, that in quite a few parts of Europe, coal power became cheaper than gas-fired. So coal consumption increased, with the IEA reporting a 14% rise in coal consumption across EU member states during 2021. Now, during much of last year, EU consumption continued to increase, driven by a combination of high gas prices and limited supplies, the loss of Russian fossil fuels, and government moves to save gas for the coming winter and beyond. But more recently, things seem to be settling down in the energy markets, with the previously high coal and gas prices returning to more, should we say, normal levels. Quite how long this situation might continue is clearly something of an unknown at the moment. Now, we tend to focus much of our attention on hard coal, but we shouldn't forget that lignite remains an important source of energy, at least in some parts of Europe. In recent years, it's been used to generate around 7% or so of the EU's electricity, and it's still an important source of energy in EU states that include, well, these shown here. But it's also used in some Eastern European countries that are not currently members of the EU, such as Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Montenegro. All of these rely on indigenous lignite for at least some of their electricity. For example, in the case of Bosnia and Kosovo, their main energy resources, they're lignite, with reserves of around 5.3 and 14 billion tonnes respectively. In fact, Kosovo's reserves are the 5th largest in the world. And of course, Germany is also a major producer and user of lignite. In 2021, Germany produced nearly half of all the lignite used in the EU. But we'll look at Germany in a little more detail a bit later. But while we're on the subject of Eastern Europe, let's look briefly at the situation there. There are a number of countries in Eastern Europe that hope to eventually become EU member states. But to achieve this, these candidate countries, as they're generally known, must agree to the EU's plan for carbon neutrality by 2050, amongst other things. The EU views the elimination of coal power plus a greater reliance on renewables as an important part of this process, and it's a route that wealthier Western member states have been following. But some Eastern European countries are poorer and rely heavily on electricity generated by hard coal and lignite-fired power plants. Unlike their richer neighbours, they simply don't have the resources to replace their existing coal power capacity with affordable, sustainable alternatives. So despite hopes by some to eventually join the EU, they look set to continue using coal power for generation for some considerable time. There are a number of reasons for this, but they generally focus on cost, availability, diversification of energy sources, the need to drive economic development, plus the lack of affordable large-scale alternatives. And of course, more recently, in the wake of what's happened in Ukraine, energy security. Countries where coal power remains particularly important include Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. For example, Kosovo gets nearly all of its electricity from coal. Serbia and Bosnia get about 3/4 of theirs, and both North Macedonia and Montenegro get half of theirs. Now, although some regional governments have pledged to follow the EU's path towards carbon neutrality, in many cases this is yet to be reflected in concrete actions, and a number of countries are pushing ahead with plans to refurbish existing coal-fired generation plants or develop new ones. The plant shown here is an example of one that's made most headway recently. This is the Tuzla 7 project in Bosnia. It's a new 450 megawatt supercritical lignite-fired unit being developed by the state-owned generator and built by a Chinese company. It's expected to come online next year, and its output will replace that from several outdated polluting coal units. So, despite the EU's drive to eliminate coal, the transition is unlikely to go smoothly in a number of Eastern Europe economies. Put simply, their options are very limited, and the use of coal mined within the national borders is viewed as key to maintaining a secure, stable, and affordable electricity supply. at least for some time. Now, from August last year, the import of Russian coal into the EU was stopped as part of the fifth package of sanctions adopted in response to the Russian invasion. Since then, European coal buyers have been sourcing supplies from around the world to replace Russian coal, and these have been coming from places such as North America, South Africa, Colombia, Indonesia, and Australia, as well as countries such as Kazakhstan. So what's Russia been doing with the coal that can no longer supply to the EU? Well, in 2021, Russia exported a total of 211 million tonnes of coal, worth around an estimated 18 billion US dollars. In that year, the EU imported nearly 52 million tonnes from Russia, roughly a quarter of Russia's total coal exports. Since the introduction of the ban, Russia's been diverting some of its coal to countries such as China, India, and Turkey, where it's found ready markets, but it's having to sell it at a significant discount of between 30 and 50%. So Russian coal exports to these countries have increased, but conversely, exports to some Asian markets such as Japan and Taiwan have fallen. Now, in 2021, the EU's 27 member states consumed 160 million tonnes of hard coal, plus 277 million tonnes of lignite, making a total of 437 million tonnes. By the end of last year, this had risen to 476 million tonnes. Now, in a typical year, the EU had been getting nearly 60% of its hard coal from outside sources. In 2020, Russia had been supplying around half of this, followed by the USA and Australia, but supplies also came from countries such as Colombia, South Africa, Indonesia, and Canada. As we just heard, in August last year, the embargo on Russian coal came into force, which effectively ended this trade. But even before this, some EU member states have been looking to get coal from elsewhere, mainly in response to the region's rapidly rising natural gas prices, but also the growing unease at the rising geopolitical tension between Russia and Ukraine. Since the start of the war, imports of non-Russian coal into the EU have carried on increasing. For example, countries such as the Netherlands, Poland, Denmark, Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, plus the UK, took in increasing amounts of coal from, for example, Colombia and South Africa. And coal imports also came from several other African suppliers such as Tanzania and Mozambique. Now, the situation varies across Europe, but coal imports have generally increased because of a combination of growing electricity demand, high natural gas prices, and the need to find alternatives to Russian fossil fuels. The IEA recently estimated that the EU's coal demand increased by around roughly 30 million tonnes last year, driven mainly by increased demand from the power sector. Some analysts think that the import of thermal coal into the EU this year could be more than in 2022, although the mild winter means that gas supplies have lasted better, and again means that coal inventories are higher than they might otherwise have been, so stocks are much higher than was feared. Now, the changing energy landscape across Europe has opened up some new possibilities for coal exports from several European countries. A number of these already export coal, mainly to their neighbours, but some others have now identified new possibilities to sell their coal further afield, as European coal buyers search for alternatives to Russian coal. And here are a few examples. During the first part of 2022, Bosnia exported around 200 kilotons of coal, much of it to neighbouring Serbia. The higher coal prices that were prevailing at the time have provided useful income for the country. And some reports suggest that Serbia could order up to 2 million tonnes of coal from Bosnia in the coming months. Similarly, nearby Kosovo also has large coal reserves and is now investigating possible exports to Germany and other European countries. Greece has large reserves of hard coal and especially lignite, and is exporting both to neighbouring North Macedonia. A little further afield, even Norway, which prides itself on its green credentials, will now keep its last working coal mine, which was due to close next year, in production for at least 2 more years, and probably beyond that date. And coal produced here is mainly exported to European markets. And finally, even Ukraine, locked in a bitter struggle with Russia, has exported coal. In September of last year, the country agreed the export of 100 kilotons of coal to help address shortages in neighbouring Poland. Now, over the past 2 years, coal-fired generation in Europe has increased steadily, even though many European countries had made plans to eliminate or greatly reduce the use of coal. And in this respect, some have progressed further than others. However, the invasion had huge impacts on the energy sector across Europe, and countries quickly drew up contingency plans to meet the challenges caused by the disruption to flows of Russian gas and the end of Russian coal imports. Russia had been supplying about 40% of Europe's gas. Now, European gas prices increased significantly during 2021, and in the months after the start of the Russian invasion, they went up even further. And for a time, supplies became increasingly tight. The result was that some countries switched back to coal power for at least part of their supply. In some European countries, coal power plants had only been allowed to operate on a limited basis, either limited capacity or restricted operating hours. However, this restriction was lifted. For example, in the Netherlands, coal plants had only been allowed to run at 35% capacity. And to compensate for reduced Russian gas supplies from June last year, they've been allowed to run at full capacity until at least the end of this year. During the past winter, a number of European countries, many of which previously announced plans to wind down coal production and coal power, actually increased its use as a means for replacing imported Russian fossil fuels. This included countries such as Austria, Czechia, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Romania, and the UK. And several others kept their options open, and with a view to possibly reactivating coal closed plants if they're needed. For example, Portugal. So as we've heard, most EU countries had announced plans to eliminate coal power in the coming years, and many of them had been in the process of closing their coal plants. However, largely because of the war and the impact on energy supplies in general, some have been reopening plants that were previously closed or put into reserve, and the lifetime of others has been extended. Governments have done this to maintain the safety and stability of national electricity systems, and crucially, to strengthen energy security. So against this background, here are a few examples of what's been happening in several European economies, some small, some large, where coal remains an option for electricity generation. So in Finland, a previously closed 560 megawatt plant was made operable again. In Romania, the government announced in 2021 that coal production would end soon, and that coal power capacity would be cut by more than 75% by 2025. But it subsequently decided to push any coal phase out back to 2032 at the soonest. In Greece, the government announced plans in 2019 to close down most of its remaining lignite-fired power plants by the end of 2023. But here again, there was a rapid return to lignite as a means for controlling the cost of energy and strengthening energy security. And in the UK, even though the government had planned to end coal power by 2024, it struck a deal with plant owners to defer closures and to remain operational status of 5 major coal units. And over the last winter, these have been warmed up on a number of occasions in readiness for operation, most recently in March when coal-generated electricity was fed into the grid. But the greatest activity in this area has been Germany, where the government has approved measures to reactivate mothballed coal power plants to help meet surging energy demand. And as I mentioned, we'll look at Germany in a little more detail a little later. Now, so far, we've concentrated mainly on thermal coal for power generation. However, coking coal remains important, especially for iron and steel production, and it's still used to produce around 60% of Europe's steel. Now, in 2014, the European Commission recognised the fundamental role of coking coal for the EU economy by placing it on what's known as the EU Critical Raw Materials List. This defines materials that need to be protected due to their economic importance and high supply risk. Now, within the EU, there are around 20 major coking coal deposits, although production is currently limited mainly to Poland and Czechia. Poland is the biggest producer. But many of Europe's bigger economies rely on coking coal, and the biggest consumers are Germany, Poland, France, the Netherlands, Czechia, and the UK. Now, although the EU has some coking coal deposits, much of its demand is met by imports. So in 2020, the EU had a total demand of around 43 million tonnes, and roughly 2/3 of this was imported. Before the ban on Russian coal, Russia had usually supplied about 10 to 11% or so of this total, but since then, this coal has been replaced by supplies from countries such as Australia, the USA, Canada, and Mozambique. Most major European steel producers only relied on Russian coal for part of their supplies, and some feel their operations have been largely unaffected by its loss, although some others are rather more concerned over possible future cost and availability issues. However, it's not necessarily the cost of coking coal, but the very high price of electricity that's been having a serious impact on some European steelmakers. This has led to the closure of several blast furnaces and direct reduction plants. Once again, it's not entirely clear how long this situation will continue. So we'll now look at a couple of European countries where coal still plays a major role, the first of which is Poland. Coal is still very important to Poland in its economy, and it's used to generate around 70% of the country's electricity, and is still widely used for household heating. Poland produces and consumes both hard coal and lignite, and in 2021, consumption was nearly 123 million tonnes. Before the ban on the import of Russian coal, around 15 to 20% of Poland's coal demand had been met with imports, mainly from Russia. Historically, Polish coal production had been gradually falling, although in the past few years there's been something of an upturn. So in 2021, nearly 108 million tonnes were produced, up from 101 in the previous year. Now, the Polish government and coal producers have been making efforts to increase domestic production further, and outputs continue to rise. For example, in March alone last year, 10.5 million tonnes of hard coal and lignite was produced, and that was the highest recorded level since 2018. The government has plans to boost output from existing mines by a further 1.5 million tonnes a year. It regards the continued use of coal, of the country's coal, as critical in controlling electricity prices and once again strengthening energy security. This determination has even involved a dispute with neighbouring Czechia over the continued operation of a major lignite mine near the border. Despite an order by the European Court of Justice to end production, the Polish government insisted that the mine would remain in operation, arguing its closure would threaten the country's energy security. Thankfully, this dispute seems to have been finally resolved, and the mine continues to operate. Now, since Russian coal imports ended last year, Poland has been getting coal from various outside sources. As part of this process, several major utilities were instructed by the government to place contracts for more than 7 million tonnes of coal from suppliers in countries that included the USA, Australia, Indonesia, South Africa, and Australia. And overall, Poland is thought to have imported perhaps around 11 million tonnes of coal during the last year. So just to summarise, well, although Poland initially agreed at COP26 to phase out coal power, possibly by the 2030s, the government later decided this wasn't going to happen, and the country would continue producing energy from coal until 2049. As we've mentioned, its continuing use is viewed as vital for managing electricity prices, and particularly providing energy security. Even though plans have recently been announced for an increased level of renewables, as well as the introduction of nuclear power, it looks pretty certain that coal will remain an important part of Poland's energy production, at least for the foreseeable future. Let's have a look at another major coal user in Europe. We'll look at Germany. Now, since the start of the European energy crisis, and following the tripling of natural gas prices, Germany turned increasingly back to coal for a significant part of its electricity. In 2021, hard coal and lignite generated 28% of the country's electricity. And last year, this crept up to 33%. At the same time, gas-fired generation fell from 15 to 12%, largely in response to the high prices and supply issues. Now, the bar chart shown here illustrates the changes that have recently occurred with the different forms of energy production. So as you can see, between 2021 and 2022, the level of coal power increased, driven by mainly concerns over cost and energy security. Output for wind and solar also increased, but conversely, the amount of natural gas declined, largely because, as I've mentioned, escalating prices and supply issues. Output from the country's 3 remaining nuclear stations also fell, as did that from hydro stations, mainly because of low water levels. As a result of this combination, that despite plans by the government to shut down much of the country's coal power capacity in the near future, coal power actually increased. During 2022, a number of hard coal and lignite-fired power plants were brought back into service, and others were made ready in case they were needed at periods of high demand. The closure dates for some other plants were also pushed back. So overall, the government brought back online nearly 6 gigawatts of mothballed coal units, as well as a number of oil-fired plants. And alongside this, several coal units, originally due to close in November of last year, are now being kept in service until at least 2024. Bringing this capacity back into service meant that Germany was able to make significant savings in gas consumption that helped the country get through the winter. So, what options are open for Germany in the future? Well, nuclear power. As I mentioned, the government kept its 3 remaining nuclear power stations, which were all due to close at the end of last year, on standby to provide backup in the event of a demand shortfall. Literally a week or so ago, it was announced that these would now be shut down permanently, so they won't be available next winter if they're needed. What about renewables? Well, although output from some renewables such as wind and solar increased in the first part of 2022, it's generally agreed that the full build out of Germany's renewable power capacity is likely to take much longer than originally planned, making it very difficult to end gas and coal-fired power generation anytime soon. Germany will probably continue to depend quite heavily on gas for some time, although coal power looks likely to continue playing a key role for at least several years. In late 2021, the newly elected German government announced it would bring forward the date for phasing out of the country's coal power from 2038 to 2030. However, the conflict in Ukraine and the impact on European energy markets saw a resurgence in German coal power. The boost to coal-based generation has helped significantly reduce Germany's gas consumption over the past winter. As I mentioned at the start, the relatively mild weather also made a major impact. So, looking to the future, crystal ball gazing. The IEA reported that global coal consumption increased by 1.2% in 2022, reaching around 8 billion tonnes. The forecast for this year is similar, with a predicted total of 8.033 billion. However, there has to be some uncertainty with this total, as it could be affected by factors such as what happens next in Ukraine, interruptions along the gas and coal supply chains, as well as events taking place on the wider European stage and global markets. So the precise total might change a bit. But what is clear is that coal regained some of its previous importance in a number of European countries, particularly for power generation. The shortage and the very high price of natural gas made coal the cheaper option for power generation for much of 2022, a situation that could potentially be repeated for the next 3 years and possibly beyond. Some analysts think that coal's limited return to favour will be short-lived, although the present situation might remind some governments that coal power has a long proven track record and doesn't need to depend heavily on one main fuel supplier, as has happened with Europe and Russian gas. Coal power can still play an important role in helping control energy prices and improve national energy security, ideally as part of a balanced portfolio of energy sources. Now, some European utilities have been making significant investment in new coal and gas infrastructure, and estimates suggest that at least 50 billion euros of new spending is planned. This is for things such as new gas import facilities, but it's also in the form of increased spending on coal power plants as they're brought back online, or measures to taken to extend their operational lifetimes. And alongside this, as we heard earlier, coal power will continue in a number of Eastern European countries, simply because they have little alternative. Of course, increased coal use invariably comes with environmental compromises, but as the head of a major European company recently said, I'll quote you here, in the fight between decarbonisation and energy security, keeping the lights on wins. That's what keeps politicians in power and stops people from rioting in the streets. Europe has managed to literally weather the storm this past winter. Generally, energy supplies have been maintained and gas and coal prices have now come back down to more realistic levels. But as I said at the start, we've been very lucky with the weather. Had the weather been colder and longer, the situation could well have been very different. The mild weather's brought Europe some time, but there are still many unknowns to play out in 2023 and beyond. The situation regarding future coal use in Europe will depend on the various factors we've talked about today, but many analysts and utilities remain concerned about how things could develop, especially during the next few years. To some extent, we're all at the mercy of global events as well as the weather, as any one of these could significantly change the direction taken. Some analysts think that coal's resurgence in Europe will be short-lived. It seems like the increased focus on coal power will last for at least the next few years, and in some cases could continue well beyond that. As the head of the IEA said recently, the crisis isn't over yet. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope you found that interesting. We'll just see if we have some questions coming in. Got one question coming so far. Seem to be having a bit of a problem with this though, but someone is asking, what's the situation in the UK regarding coal use for power generation in the future? Well, I mentioned that the UK government had arranged with some of the utilities in the UK to keep 5 units spread across 3 coal-fired power plants. These were made ready and kept on standby. These were units at Drax, West Burton and Ratcliffe. As again I mentioned, they were warmed up on a number of occasions when periods of high demand or cold weather were expected. Although, again, as the winter was relatively mild, their overall contribution wasn't great. But of course, they were there, ready to generate if they were needed. I think the last time electricity was fed into the grid was a few weeks ago from the Ratcliffe power station. I've seen recent media reports in the last week or so that it looks like 2 of these plants are now set to close permanently, and that only 1 will remain operable for next winter if it's needed. The owners of, I think, Drax and West Burton have said they won't be able to commit to the new emergency power contracts next winter, even though the government has asked them to do so. And they're putting this down to things such as staffing, safety and engineering issues. I mean, after all, these are fairly old plants. It looks like Ratcliffe has entered into a contract for next winter, so presumably that'll continue operating. But of course, I know I keep harping on about the weather, but that may well have a major impact. If I have a question here, what do you think will be the impact of a settlement in Ukraine on coal? Even if the conflict was resolved fairly soon, I think it's highly unlikely we will see Russian coal coming into Europe, probably for a generation or more. I think Russia has lost a major market for all of its fossil fuels in Europe, and I think there's just too much distrust of what may happen in the future. I may be wrong, but it's crystal ball gazing. But I think now that Europe is now sort of set in its ways to sort of import its energy, its fossil energy in terms of gas, oil and coal from elsewhere. I think Russia now has lost Europe as a market, as I say, probably for a generation or more, even if the conflict was resolved tomorrow, which does seem unlikely. Well, we don't seem to have any more questions at the moment. If anyone would like to follow up any points we've made today, just drop me an email and I'll do my best to answer them outside of the meeting then. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And all that's left for me to say now is that the slides from this webinar will be available to download from our webinar page on the website shortly. And next month's webinar from us will be on the 10th of May and will be presented by Dr. Leslie Sloss. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.